please tell us a bit more on the map or all this walking and all this geography that you...
The more I travelled to do the research before my first book came out, which is In the Tracks of the Camel Men. Mm-hmm. And in there, I wanted to understand how far these men walked, because the Cameleers walked with their camels. They didn't go riding on the camels because they believed that every camel that carried supplies or wool was an income for them. So they would walk with the camels. So I wanted to understand how far these men penetrated this continent. And I wanted to understand what it was that they were carrying on their camels' backs. So I put together this map to show you how far these men penetrated this continent. There was no other animal, horse or cattle, that could actually serve the interior of the continent. Now, to get a country going, it has to have an income from its resources. And it just so happens in Australia that our resources are in the desert. The continent of Australia is desert, and that's where our resources are. Mm. So, for example, Port Adelaide down here is where the first camels arrived. Thomas Elder brought the camels in, and eventually on the coast over there, other Cameleers were bringing more camels to this country. But they would walk from their Ghan towns like Mari and Farina and Unadata with their camels, and they would go, for example, from Unadata all the way to Tennant Creek and back again. That would be like a 6-month journey, taking supplies to overland telegraph stations, to gold mining centres. Altunga is a gold mining centre in the heart of a really arid valley, and it had gold. The government wanted the gold, but only the Cameleers could take supplies and then bring the gold out. They would walk from Bourke, which was the headquarters of Abdul Wahid's camel company. They would walk up to Cloncurry with supplies and bring back wool. So across this map, the shaded areas show you the extent of the Cameleers helping pastoralists get wool back to London. And that stimulated the economy of the continent.
Mm. When you're showing on the map, it looks very, very easy job sort of things. But honestly, when you're traveling there, it's too difficult. Even with an air conditioning car, with train, with all of this. And I can't explain how these people would survive here, and then how tough this Afghan was actually, and how important actually role they played then for Australian development, isn't it?
That's right, because the resources were in the desert. The sheep's wool was in the desert, gold was in the desert, all through here. So the only way to get that gold out to London, which was their market, was to walk. Mm. Now, what were they experiencing? So these men would walk 10 to 15 miles a day. Mm. Once they loaded the camels in the morning, they walked non-stop. They would then camp at night. So they would do 10 to 15 kilometres a day. Now, they would walk across deserts over here, like the Sturt Stony Desert. I have pictures of the Sturt Stony Desert, but not with me. Like, their camels walked on rocks. There's no grass, there's no water. No other animal could do what these men did. And they would take the wool of these massive sheep stations and bring it down, first of all, to Port Augusta and then to the rail line as it got laid. The camels carried... there's an amazing photograph of Cameleers loading railway sleepers onto camels, which they'd never done before. Mm. So they had to adapt to what was the market for them, what was the way they were going to earn an income. They walked across sand dunes, they walked across plains. Now, they had an idea where water would be, but sometimes they might not get to water for 3 days. So on their camels, they used to carry little water bags attached or hanging from the saddle of a camel to take some water with them. But they didn't have water every night. They walked in hot temperatures. Mm. I interviewed a son of one of the Afghan Cameleers here at Mari, and he said his father walked up the Birdsville track, up to Birdsville to take supplies, and then bring wool and mail back, and that was a 3-month trip, just that short part there. But he walked through sand dunes, and when the floods came and the rains came, the Cameleers were not held back by that. I know that they took a different route. So they would go up on a cliff with the camels and come down the other side. They were so resilient.
It is actually when we're listening and hearing all of this, it could have been a very tough job. But when you're saying hot temperature, how hot that could be?
Well, in those days it was in Fahrenheit, so I guess if you convert it to Celsius now, the Cameleers probably, sometimes they loaded, sometimes they camped at night when it was cooler, and they might start walking in the morning to beat the high heat of the middle of the day. So we'd be talking over 40 degrees Celsius easily in some of these parts around here where there's sand and stone, and the nights would be very cold, but they would camp at night. For food for them along the way, all they would take with them was dates, from what I understand, dates and flour and water, because they would make chapati or parathas in the campsite. But when they would get to a sheep station where they would take supplies and pick up wool, they would get a sheep killed and they would kill it their way, the religious way, to have halal meat, and then they would have meat with them for a while. But they didn't have top quality food all the time, and they had to really monitor their food intake. And when they would, the only time they stopped, I think, was during Ramadan. They would then not work, and they would rest then. But most of the year they just kept on working.
So month of Ramadan, they were not working at all?
No, they didn't work as much during Ramadan.
Okay.
And the wonderful thing, at the end of Ramadan, they did have a big, they call it charity. They would come together and have a feast. Now, some of the Afghans came down to the first mosque that they built in Adelaide, where they would travel all the way from there and come to the mosque in Adelaide, down here, and they would have a big charity at the mosque in Little Gilbert Street in southwest Adelaide, and it would go for 6 days and nights.
They were walking all the way to here?
Well, they did at first, but eventually the train was laid from up to Murray. Murray was a terminus for a while, and so eventually people heard about Afghan Cameleers travelling by train, if they could afford it though, from Murray to Port Augusta. That train was called the Great Northern Railway, and it was built in the 1870s and 1880s. But one day someone saw an Afghan, when the train stopped at one of the places to get coal for steam and water, they saw an Afghan get off and get his mat out. They always carry their mats with them, and he got on the ground to pray. And then people began to nickname that train the Ghan Express, and then it became the Ghan train. That's how it got its name. But it was a respectful thing. There was a lot of respect for the Cameleers in the outback.
And we come on the topic of the Ghan and Ghan train and stuff. I was just wondering, because you keep it down before actually, what is the Western Australia history, obviously, in terms of Afghan Cameleers? Because we can see lots of walking and history around there. What is actually that some good stories that you can tell us?
Well, South Australia was the first state to have camels and Afghan Cameleers. And then when gold was discovered over here in the 1880s, 1890s, some of the Afghans would leave Maree. They either walked across land down here past Eucla and came into the goldfields and started to set up little Ghan towns and camps, or they would carry the camels by ship all the way around to Fremantle. They would walk from the Fremantle port of Perth through Perth's main city, because I've seen a photograph of that, and they would walk to Southern Cross and to Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie, where they set up their camel strings, and then they began to set up little camel camps all throughout the area where the goldfields were.
Okay, so the main job of the Cameleers then was to actually take the supply to the goldfield and bring the...
And take... Now, here there are no forests, and of course gold is discovered in a desert, and you need wood for the smelters to melt the gold down, to take out the impurities. So they would cart a lot of wood. Their purpose of carting is very different story to here. They used to cart wood here to the smelters, and they would do a lot of wood carting for smelters and for domestic fires, and they would cart wood for the lining of the mines. But there's no water out here. And thousands of people came here looking for a good luck story in their life. So the Cameleers had to cart water as well. They carted so much water. And then, of course, once all the railheads began to get set up as they helped to lay the railway line, then they would have to take supplies to all these little towns as well to keep them going. It was an amazing... Without them, without the Cameleers, the population of Western Australia could not have shifted to exist in the desert without them.
Do they appreciate it now?
Oh, yeah, look, yes, definitely. there is I just read a quote. At the time, people realised that
You can keep it down, Pamela. Things,
Oh, thank you. This was written about the Cameleers, that it was they heard about the motors coming, and this is the 1920s now. The motors were going to come to the outback, and so there was talk about the fact that the train would replace the Cameleers. And that's a sad story, actually. There's a beautiful photograph of about 100 Cameleers in their whole traditional costume in 1896 in Coolgardie, with the camels all lined up in a big crescent shape, fully decorated. Like in the early days, the Cameleers were highly decorated. If you look at the new coin that's been released, it shows the Cameleer with all the decorations.
Decoration, yeah.
Beautiful. You can imagine that the camels would have had rugs on them and cloths on them as well that came from India and Afghanistan with all the tribal patterns. But there's a beautiful picture of the Afghans standing there to welcome to Coolgardie, the governor from Perth, to launch the end of the new railway line. It was a wonderful day. And the Afghans gave all their names on a piece of paper to the governor, and they saluted the governor. But the thing was also, it's a sad photograph because that's the beginning of the end of the Cameleers, you could say, because in the end, the railway lines replaced the need for so many camels. But the partnership between camels and the Ghan continued into the 1930s, because where the train went, the Cameleers still had to go out into the scrub, out into the hinterland to get the wool and the gold to bring it to the train. So there was an amazing partnership there.
Right. You said you started your research in 1980s. Yeah? Exactly 1980.
Yes, 1980.
How long it took to finish the book?
Well, I was full-time teaching. I've been full-time teaching the whole time I did all of this, and it's an amazing thing when one looks back on their life how one can do this. But I was driven. Once I got started, I was just so driven. So every school holidays, I would travel to Alice Springs or to Perth or to Darwin or to Brisbane. I would research the archives and old newspapers, but I would track down the descendants. So I met most of the families across Australia and their children, and I've kept in touch with those descendants because I believe if you want to tell the story about people in another country, the government records are not giving you the point of view of the people who actually are the descendants who experience it. Because government records have a purpose in the way they're written. So I travelled, and then I'd come home, and then during school week I'd do my lesson preparation. On the weekends I'd start to write my chapters.
So it took how many years?
Well, in the end, that first book was finished after 7 years, and then that book took another 10 years of research. That got launched 3 times. And then I did this book to celebrate another centenary, and that took another 2.5 years to write. But the story of the Cameleers here is different to the story there. I don't repeat stories. I don't make my writing boring. I make it always original. So that's more research there. That's not in the first 2 books.
Oh, how